Okay. Henry, can you hear me okay?
I hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much for joining us tonight.
Real pleasure.
That was definitely some wonderful insights into your breeding program there and what you do. Henry, one of the things I noticed when I visited your breeding facility, you can see it on the video there tonight, your breeding cages are much longer than what most of us would typically use. I assume this is to allow the birds to maintain a high level of fitness. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, it is the same principle as the flights. I have very long flights. The breeding cages are about 1 meter long, and the idea is having birds that can fly between the two perches at the ends and keep a good level of fitness. So it's really for fitness.
Yep. Okay. One of the observations I took away from visiting you that wasn't in the video tonight was your process of moving eggs. Moving eggs, I've found, can be treacherous. But I noticed when I was there that it appeared that you kissed the eggs. I assumed at first for good luck, but when I probed you about it, you told me it was so you could find a hen with a similar incubation temperature for the eggs. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, the hens do incubate at totally different temperatures. To check that, if you get an egg from different nests and hold it to your lips, the lips are very sensitive. You can feel the different temperatures. I really, though, try to move the eggs early in the piece when you first can see that they're fertile, or 2 or 3 days before they're due to hatch. Not so successful if they're halfway through. So often when I've got chicks and too many eggs, I've got that with a few pairs at the moment, I then try to find a place to move the bigger chicks and leave the eggs to hatch under the normal pair.
That makes good sense. Henry, you're well known with your birds for when you're keeping them, for using them very lightly in the breeding cage. You know, we'll often read a Henry George auction catalogue that says you've only used this once or twice, and it may be a 2 or 3 year old bird. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, I probably keep too many birds at times, so I do try to let them only have 2 nests a year, and I like to leave them a year between breedings. Sometimes that doesn't work out, but that's what I generally try to do. So there's plenty of time for them to get over the fact of having reared nests of chicks.
Okay. I have seen some breeders advocate, obviously, that the first 5 pairs that they put up are their best 5 pairs from last year. Obviously, if you're pairing them up and taking 2 rounds and resting them for a year, is that something that you typically do? Would you put your best pairs from the year before back together, or do you try and find a different mate for them?
I always try and find a different mate. I think there's only ever once that I've put the same pairs together 2 years in a row. Okay. Because I really want to be able to get youngsters from the better birds from different birds, so I have the relationships to bring the youngsters back together.
Understood. As a breeding team, you mentioned in the video that you won't use a bird that can't fly. What else don't you suffer well in terms of faults? What's out the door at Henry George's place? Long flights? What is it that you don't suffer well?
Well, I don't suffer long flights. I don't suffer extra long tails. I've seen these extra long tails really appear in England and Europe. And when I judged the World Show in Portugal 4 years ago, there were quite a number of really big, powerful birds with good heads, tails so long that they were touching the floors of the cage. I no awarded all those birds.
Fair enough.
And I wouldn't use those birds myself in a breeding cabinet.
Yep. Talking about feather and feather length and things of the like, Would you use a bird with feather issues in the breeding cage?
What do you classify as feather issues?
Well, I guess that leads on to my next question is French molt and your theories on it. So
I would not use a bird with French molt. I know people in England and Europe have, and maybe still do, because when I was going around the aviaries there, some of the breeders said if I hadn't used a bird with French molt, because it had a lot of good features, I wouldn't have the birds that I have today. So obviously some of them do, but not for me, no. I will use a bird that has had French molt as a baby and has come back and is fully feathered and is absolutely normal and is flying around in the aviary. I know a lot of people won't, but I do, because I believe that bird has built up the resistance to the virus, and hopefully that resistance will be passed on to its offspring.
when you have a bird that comes out of a nest as a baby and it does lose its flights, do you categorize that as French molt, or is that a stress molt, or is that something different?
Well, it can be a stress molt. It can be a molt from inadequate feeding from the parents. Yes, I would normally put it in a holding cage. If it's only dropped its some flights and tail and they grow back normally, that's not a worry for me. But if it starts losing more feathers, well, it's a French molter or a runner, and it's out. Yeah.
So in terms of the French molt, you mentioned obviously it's a virus. What is your experience with it? Is it something that's hereditary? Is it something that is, does it, once you start getting one, do you find them across multiple nests? What's your experience?
What you just said, like this last year, I've had one bird, one solitary baby that's been a French molt, and it only just dropped its flights. But sometimes once French molt starts, it seems as though it can spread around a lot of the nests, and frequently you get a lot. But luckily, I don't know what I've done, but I have had, touch wood, a very little French molt in recent years.
Well, I think a lot of it in my mind would be linked to how lightly you're using the birds. So 2 rounds and a year break sort of falls in line with what Frank McGovern shared with us, that you need to be very mindful of the birds and the stress that you're placing on them by breeding with them all the time. And obviously if you're using them very lightly, even though you do have a good number of breeding cages and a good number of birds there, it would be unlikely, based on that theory, that you would see much of it. So another question for you, Henry. When the cull is completed, how many cocks and hens do you generally try to hold in the stud?
Well, I generally look to hold about 100 cocks and 150 hens. More hens than cocks, because they seem to have more problems with hens. More hens die than cocks in the breeding regime. But that's the sort of number I look at, yes. But of course, when I have a good breeding year, there's a lot of the numbers increase. That's where I am now. Yeah.
How many breeding cages do you run during the breeding season?
Well, I have a total of 75. I used to, on occasions, I have used them all. Now, getting older and the back problems that I've got, I don't use the bottom row of cages. Sometimes I might use them temporarily just as holding cages, but I don't use them as breeding cages. So I use the top 2 rows, which will give me anything up to 50. Mostly recently, I've probably used about 30 a year at a time.
Okay, now that makes good sense. Speaking of getting out there and tending to them, how long do you generally spend out there each day with the birds? Well,
obviously, it depends a lot whether I'm breeding or not. But in the breeding time, every operation seems to take me 2 hours. So I do 2 hours on feeding, 2 hours on waters, anything up to 2 hours checking nests. So I can be in there up to 6 hours a day in the breeding time.
And how long are you leaving the artificial lighting on out there for?
Well, it's on a timer. Around about 10 o'clock at night, the lighting, they're on automatic dimmers. The lights slowly go out and then go out totally, except for 2 net lights, which are just small lights with a 15 amp bulb in.
Yep. And do you keep that the same all year round, or do you try and allow for some sort of replication of the seasons? Do you power it back any time during the year?
Probably should, but I don't. Yeah, very rarely do I do it.
Okay. Questions come through on a chat for me. It's saying, how many birds do you generally breed in a season, Henry?
These days, I only get about 300 rings, so I'm stopping at 300. I think next year I've only ordered 200 rings. So yeah, I'm not breeding the huge numbers. In the past, I have bred as many as 5 when I had all the cages going, maybe 5, maybe even 600, but not in recent years.
Okay. Another question that's being asked to me on the side here, I can see on the chat, it says, what age do you generally start to use your cocks and hens? Do you wait a full 12 months, or will you use a bigger hen if she looks ready to go at an earlier age of 6 or 9 months?
Yes, I would use the bigger hen, maybe not 6 months, but 8 or 9 months. So yes, the bigger hens in breeding condition, I will certainly use them at that time. I didn't used to. They always used to be at least 10 months or maybe 11 months, but I think as we've got some bigger birds and we've got more feather, it's better to use some of them early if they're in condition, and that's the criteria, if they're in condition. Yeah.
Well, that makes good sense. And I saw obviously you have the log inside of the aviary, particularly for the hens, just to be able to visualize that interest. Once you see them playing with the log and their feather coming into condition, obviously it's a good sign.
That I use to catch them and pair them up, yes.
Yeah. I've got another question that's come through on the side here. Somebody has asked, if you have a very good hen that only lays small clutches, is that something that you typically persist with?
I very rarely had that problem. Mostly my hens lay large clutches of eggs, so it's not a problem that I've experienced very often. I'm trying to think what I do if it does occur, but really 5 or 6 eggs seems to be the minimum. Anything up to 10 eggs that I'm getting from the birds, so it's not a problem. Getting them all fertile, that's a problem.
Yes, no, I can imagine. So I have got somebody send a joke through here, and it says, if I come and steal 3 eggs off that cinnamon hen and she only lays 3 eggs, will you sell it to me?
I'd have to judge the bird and the occasion. I might or I might not. But I haven't had that problem, as the good birds only laying 3 eggs.
No, that's understandable. I've got another question here. Somebody's asked, they said they've bred a nice bird which molted out, but it's come through with a feather cyst on one of the wing butts. They've asked, in your experience, do you think that's worth breeding with, or is this something that's genetic?
I would rarely breed with them, but if the bird was good enough, I would squeeze the cyst out, put betadine into it. I generally use one of the little syringes and put the betadine in that and put the syringe right into the hole, so it makes sure that the betadine gets right in there. Mostly I find that fixes them up. I'm not quite sure what the cause of those cysts are, but yeah, but if you get those massive cyst birds that occasionally have the massive cysts, no, I wouldn't use those. But the small one, if I can cure it, I'd certainly use them. And it doesn't seem to be genetic, because I think we get families that are doing it.
I've got a question come through here. Somebody's asked, do you generally, particularly for those bigger hens, tend to run any sort of fosters? Or do you let them raise their own?
I generally always let them rear at least one nest of their own, be it the first or the second. I guess that depends what other birds are at similar timing. But I do let all the pairs rear at least one nest on their own and then foster them out. And that pied cock that I was showing before, I've had 3 nests from him. I let him rear 2 nests and the third was fostered out.
Yeah. Another question that's being asked here, what sort of products do you generally put into water? Are you trying to use natural products? I remember back in the day, you used to use a vitamin that was used for infants in the water.
Still one of the ones, yeah. Yeah, still use that. I have 3 or 4 different ones. I use the KD powder 1 day a week. Pentavite, which is the one you're talking about for babies. In fact, I just went to the chemist today and got some more of that because it had run out. So
the chemist gave you a very strange look when you're asking for infant.
At my age, I probably think it's great-grandchildren, of which I have 2.
Oh dear. So you're using the Pentavite for how many days a week?
Nearly everything is only 1 day a week, yeah. I do Soluvite debrider as well, calcium. I have a whole series of different things that I put in the water, but they're normally there 1 day a week each.
Now, just to go back to the question before, the person who'd messaged me is just seeking clarification. When you say about the fosters, you do move birds around, but what they were actually asking that I'd misunderstood, you don't put any specific foster pairs down. You don't keep any birds specifically as fosters, do you?
No, I don't keep any specific fosters. I use the birds that haven't got very many fertile eggs or babies hatching to foster from those that have a lot. Yeah.
Now, question for you, Henry. How do you determine if you've had a good, bad, or indifferent season? Is it mortality rate? Is it chicks on the perch? Is it show wins? What is it?
It's really looking at the quality of birds I've bred, not necessarily mortality or show wins or anything. I don't show very often these days, about 3 shows a year, which I need to do for keeping my judge's certificate going. Yeah. So 3, maybe 4 shows a year, that's all I do these days. Yeah.
And tell me, what are you trying to achieve with the birds this season?
Well, in the past, I've really gone for size, shape, balance, and deportment. I like nice, long birds. I have not worried so much about what has now become the all-important directional feather. This last year, I have concentrated on improving the directional feather, and I'm very happy with the results. So I've got quite a lot of birds now with the good directional feather and the size and the length. Because I've seen other fanciers in the past concentrate on the directional feather, the birds getting smaller and smaller as the directional feather got greater. But well, you saw that Spangled Grey that was up before. That was last year's breeding. A lot of the birds from that cinnamon pie that was on before, they nearly all got the directional feather. That whole family has got that. So, yeah.
Now, one of the questions being asked here, Henry, do you bring in many outcrosses?
No, not normally. Last year, I went on a bit of a splurge at Newcastle auction and bought quite a number of outcrosses. This year, I haven't bought any. Probably won't next year. So every probably about 3 years, I get some outcrosses in.
But you generally try to breed your say your grey line and your blue line separately, so that you can outcross from in-house. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, that you say the grey line, blue line, it's all the same line. The grey line, the blue line, the grey-green, they're all intermingled, so they actually are the same line. I guess had a lot more success perhaps with greys, but that's just the way the cookies crumbled.
Now I'm getting a question asked, and it's preluded with, I'm just a beginner here. It says, small birds bred from bigger birds, are they worth keeping or not?
I think it depends on the features and if that the bird has got, other than size. But if it's got a lot of good features, yes, I keep it and use it, but it would go to a much larger bird.
Yeah.
So that you're pushing it the size back again. And I have used this last year, what I was just saying, I've used 2 or 3 shorter birds that have got the directional feather rather than my preferred long birds.
One of the questions I'm being asked here, Henry, your thoughts on artificial insemination for, say, an injured good bird. So if you had a bird that had hurt its wing or damaged it, rather than obviously genetic faults or something like that, is that something that you'd consider?
I don't do artificial insemination, but I would definitely consider it. I've got a couple of friends who do it, and that sort of bird, yes, I would do it if it was an injury and broken wing, a cock that can't mount the hen. I have done occasional artificial insemination of those sort of birds, but generally I don't do artificial insemination.
Yep.
I've never learned. I need more lessons from you, Troy.
Henry, you've won almost as many national titles as I've had birthdays. You've mentioned in the video your most memorable one being the first one.
Yes.
You also won 7 in 1 year in 2015. It looks like you've won almost every variety kept. What's left for Henry George other than taking up fallows and grey wings?
Well, I'm not going to do either of those. I've cut back the number of varieties that I keep. I used to even keep clear wings, and I won the nationals with them as well, but I haven't had those for a few years. A good friend of mine, Dow Cameron in Toowoomba, got all my clear wings, and they used to use Texas clear bodies, and they've gone to another fancier, to keep the line going. Yes, so I'm basically now breeding normals, cinnamons, opalings, dominant pies, and recessive pies. I am doing the recessive pies, but mainly as I've cut back numbers, I've cut back the varieties. So
what's driving you to be out there for 6 hours a day? In the breeding season, 7 days a week, being a part of this hobby, what's driving you forward?
Well, I just want to breed the best birds I possibly can.
No, that's very understandable.
It doesn't really worry me anymore. I've had sufficient of that, so I still would like it. As I said before, I only show probably 3 shows a year, but I normally try and get birds into the Queensland team for the nationals, of course. Yeah.
Yep. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the future of the hobby. What do you think we can do to encourage more members into the hobby, and particularly how can we attract some young people to the hobby?
This is probably the biggest question that we should all be addressing, because with the advent of the computer and mobile phones, and the young people often come into it maybe in the very early teens, but by the time they get into the late teens, they're more interested in doing other things and the opposite sex. But quite a number of them do come back again later in life when they've married and got children of their own, and a lot of them start up again. I would like to have an answer as to how to encourage them. And I think one thing that is discouraging them is the very high prices that the better birds are bringing, and that people are selling them for, because beginners really, they don't have the knowledge, and most of them can't afford to pay the sort of huge thousands of dollars that the better birds are sometimes going for. So that's a negative for the hobby, I think, the price of better birds.
If you found yourself as a beginner again, Henry, what would you recommend and what advice would you give? How do you think beginners can best learn?
Well, I think the best advice I can give is don't buy birds from here, there, and everywhere, and try and mix them up and try and breed good birds. Select maybe 2 or even 3 breeders and get birds from those 2 or 3 breeders and breed them together and get them from, as I say, top quality breeders. And most breeders will sell not their top birds, but will sell youngsters from their top birds to beginners at reasonable prices. I know I do.
Yeah. And how do you think those beginners can best learn? Is it by, I guess, tailing around with an open or a champion breeder, or is it attending shows and stewarding? How do you think the best way is for a beginner to increase their experience and knowledge of the hobby?
Definitely from spending the time with breeders and talking to them as to how they breed and what they do and everything like that, as distinct from shows. Shows will only teach them what a show bird looks like. They won't teach them how to breed the birds and how to care for them, which good older breeders will be able to tell them.
Yep. Now, while we've been talking, I've got a few more messages that have been sent through to me on the side here. One of the questions being asked, what feature or features do you think we need to most concentrate on improving in this country?
Well, I think it is the directional feather. It is happening. But I have seen some of the European bred birds that I think have really been taken just too far. They've got so much feather that what I said before, birds have got to fly, they've got to see. Some of that directional feather is going so much on some birds that it's going over the eyes. So to me, that's gone too far. Birds are meant to fly. And I've seen breeders' cages where they've got ladders and things from the floor up to the perches because the birds can't fly from the floor up to the perches.
Yep.
You won't find any ladders in my aviary.
Now, Henry, talking about feather, do you give anything in terms of the soft food mix that you're doing to provide, in your mind, an extra level of protein for the exhibition Budgerigar feather that we talk about?
Yes, well, we've got a veterinarian in Brisbane here who produces a product called High Pro, and which is a high protein, as the name suggests. I use that all the time when I'm doing the feeding. They get a little, each pair gets some of that in the cage, and I also have a bowl of it in all of the weanlings' flight cages and flights, so that builds up the protein, as well as what we talked about before, all the different things you put in the drinking water.
Speaking of the drinking water, one of the questions that came through, just to clarify, they were asking, did you say that you do give liquid calcium once a week in the water?
Yes, once a week or once every 10 days, yeah.
Yep.
Calcium is the one I use, actually.
Another question being asked regarding inbreeding. They've said, say, cousin to cousin. Would you close mate them again in the following season? So you put a pair of cousins together in 2020 and you bred some nice birds out of them. Do those birds get cousins from different cousins in 2021, or do you look to go out and in, or how close do you keep them?
I will use different cousins in a second year. But then, yes, you've got to go in and out, otherwise you lose fertility. Many years ago, I had golden, this is before the English birds came in, I had golden faces, and I got the beautiful golden faces, black and white wings and violet bodies with no body colour. and I kept them very close. I think I won first and second in one nationals, and so what the mistake I made is I kept all the youngsters, and because they were very good, sold the parents, and I lost it in that 1 year. Those youngsters just did not breed. So you can go too close too long. Another example of that was Dr. Robertson in South Africa. I visited him on one occasion. He had a lot of breeding cages. He was a great exponent of inbreeding, and the year I visited him, had a beautiful stud of birds. He had, out of all those nests, one fertile egg. I kept in touch with him over the phone afterwards. He put them down again, and he got one more fertile egg. So in that season, he got 2 fertile eggs. He lost it in 1 year, and he got out of birds after that. He didn't keep going, but he'd written books. He'd written lots of things of keeping going on the inbreeding.
Okay.
And he went too far and lost it.
One of the questions being asked, Henry, if you were to have a nest, say your 6 eggs and 3 of them weren't fertile, or let's call it 8 and 4 aren't fertile, does that draw a flag with you if you're only getting half of the eggs fertile, 50%?
It does happen. I will though use the youngsters from that nest, but then I'll break that pair up and put them with different partners.
The question being asked is, if you do see those sort of fertility issues, is there anything in particular in your experience that you do to change the diet at all of the birds?
No, I've kept the diet pretty consistent. I don't think that it's dietary. I think it's more likely too close to breeding, too much inbreeding in it, trying to improve the birds.
Fair enough.
I could be wrong on that, but that's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you've certainly been doing it for enough years to hold a weighted opinion on that. So I'm sure people will appreciate that. Henry, tell us, obviously you are a world recognised judge. Do you want to share with us some of your experiences of travelling overseas, travelling the world for budgerigars?
Well, I haven't done a great deal of overseas judging. I did that world show in Lisbon, Portugal a few years ago. I've judged in New Zealand, but most of my judging has been here in Australia. There was a thing that you might find a little bit amusing. Many years ago, when I was in England, I was stewarding to one of the very well-known judges at the time, and he had to go to the toilet. So as a steward, I said to some of the other stewards, if you're happy, I'll get what I think quickly all the best birds and put them up at the front. Which I did before he came back. Well, he looked at these birds, he walked up and down, he scratched his head, he couldn't work it out. He said, never seen that before. In the 5 top birds, the top 4 are in the 5 already. An interesting thing. I told him afterwards what I'd done, and it was a joke between us for a long time.
Nice. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the friendships you've forged in this hobby, be it here in Australia or overseas? I know many years ago, obviously, you travelled to the UK and you were of fundamental importance, obviously, when we set up the initial importation of budgerigars. You must have made some lifelong friends in the hobby at that point.
I certainly did. Sort of like, but unfortunately, most of them have passed on now. Like Doug Sadler, he was a very close friend. He came over here and stayed with me. I've stayed with him over there, and there was a group of English judges came out, and we went out west to see the wild budgerigars out there in the west, and they really enjoyed that. Actually, Mick Lay, the beekeeper, we met him out there, and John Scoville was with him, and we went round, and they showed us where they were and saw the flocks of the wild budgies. They were thrilled about that. Yeah, yeah. There's a few friends over there.
Yeah, excellent.
But when you sort of get, I'm 84 in a couple of months, and when you get to my age, a lot of them are not around anymore, I'm afraid. But I've got a lot of younger friends here in Australia in the bird fancy.
Now, Henry, it looks like I've just had one more last question come through. It says, with regard to that response you gave before about fertility, they're asking if you do have an issue with fertility with that particular pair, would you break them up after one round, or do you normally persist and give them a second round, particularly if it's their first time breeding?
I know if it's the first time breeding, I normally persist and give them a second round, and very frequently the second round is a very fertile round. So not always, there's no 100%, but yes, I would always give them a second round. I work on 2 strikes and they're out, so if they don't do any good in 2 rounds, then I split them up and put them with other partners, or leave them for a year, whichever. Excellent.
All right, well, I think I've managed to get it through everyone's questions that have been flooding down the side of my screen. Thank you very, very much for your time tonight, Henry. It's been very insightful, and thank you to Jonathan for going up and doing the video for us, flying up to Queensland and doing that for Henry. If there's nothing else, I will hand back to Chris. I assume Chris is still on here.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry, for a fantastic chat and a fantastic video. And just so everyone does know, we did not fly Jonathan up there. He went up there on business, and the dates lined up beautifully, and Jonathan was able to spend the morning and Henry's doing the recording. So no, we did not fly him up there. It was a secondary part of his visit. So anyway, that's enough of that. So look, thanks everyone. Hope you had a great night. Once again, thank you, Henry, for supporting us and helping us out, and being such a fantastic guest for Troy to interview. So thank you both very much, and thanks, Troy, for the moderating tonight and the preparation work that goes into this as well. Good night, everyone. Jonathan, if you can just give everyone a couple of seconds before you press that that disconnect button, like I know you love to do. Everyone to say goodbye. We'll see you all in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you. Congratulations, Kerry and Murray.
You're doing a terrific job, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Jonathan's kind of asleep.
Is he?
I don't know.